So now something has changed. Not in the village, not in the routine. Everything outside is still exactly the same, but inside, something has started to stay. Not a thought, not an emotion, more like a presence. Thomas woke up again. Same place, same light slowly entering the room, same silence. But this time he didn't move immediately. He just lay there, eyes open, breathing steady, and there it was again, that quiet awareness. Not strong, not overwhelming, just there. Before, mornings would begin without being noticed. Now, the beginning of the day could be felt. Not as something new, but as something repeating. And that repetition didn't feel invisible anymore. After a while, he sat up, slowly, not thinking, just moving. He stepped outside. The air felt the same. The sky looked the same. But now, instead of just seeing it, he seemed to register it. Not deeply, just enough to notice that he was seeing it. And then, like always, he started walking. Same path, same ground, same direction. But this time, each step felt slightly more separate. Before, walking was just movement. Now, each step could almost be noticed individually, not in a mindful, peaceful way, just in a quiet, almost empty awareness. Step, step, step. No meaning attached, just repetition being seen. At the field, he picked up his tool again. Dig, lift, move, repeat. But now, between each action, there was a space, a very small space, where nothing happened. And in that space, there was that same quiet presence again, not asking anything, not saying anything, just existing. At one point, he stopped, not because he needed to, but because the movement didn't continue on its own for a moment. He stood still, holding the tool, looking at the ground, and then, for the first time, something almost became a full thought. Not clear, not complete, but closer than before. Something like, why this? But it didn't fully form. It didn't turn into a real question. It didn't continue. It just appeared halfway and then disappeared. And he went back to working, like always. Because even when something starts to form, habit is stronger. Back in the village, the same quiet changes continued in others too. People paused more, spoke less, looked longer at simple things. Not with curiosity, not with confusion, just looking. The woman by the water held a piece of cloth in her hand for a long time without moving, not thinking, not distracted, just still. Then suddenly she continued washing, like nothing happened. The blacksmith stopped in the middle of a strike, hammer raised, frozen for a second, then clang. He continued. No reaction, but the pause had been there. And somehow those pauses started to feel like the most real moments of the day. Not the work, not the movement, but the gaps between them. Even time itself felt different now. Before, it passed without being noticed. Now it was present. Not fast, not slow, just there. Like something sitting quietly beside everything that happened. Thomas began to notice the end of things, not in a big way, just small endings. The end of a movement, the end of a step, the end of a breath, each one finishing, and then another beginning. But the beginnings didn't feel important, only the endings stood out slightly, because they created those small empty spaces. And in those spaces, there was that same quiet presence again. One evening, he sat outside again. Same place, same view, but this time he didn't look at anything in particular. His eyes were open, but his attention wasn't fixed. It was wide, like everything was being seen at once, but nothing was being focused on. The sky changed color slowly, Light faded, darkness came, and through all of that, he didn't react. He didn't think, "It's getting dark." He didn't think anything, but somehow it was all being noticed, without words, without meaning, just happening and being there. At one point, a sound came again, from far away, similar to before, distant, unclear, but this time, instead of just hearing it and letting it pass, he noticed the moment it appeared and the moment it disappeared, the beginning and the end, and the space after. That space felt longer, not actually longer, just more visible. He stayed outside for a long time, longer than any other day, not because he wanted to, but because there was no reason to move. Eventually, he stood up, went inside, lay down, closed his eyes, but again, sleep didn't come immediately. He stayed there, aware of the darkness behind his eyes, of his breathing, of the slight movement of his body, and of something else, the quiet sense that everything he did would repeat. Not as a fear, not as a problem, just as a fact. And for the first time, that fact didn't feel invisible. It felt present, not heavy, not light, just there. After some time, he slept, and the next day came again. But now the repetition couldn't fully hide itself anymore. It was visible, not clearly, but enough to be noticed. And once something is noticed, it doesn't go back to being completely unseen. Life continued, the same way, same actions, same patterns, same silence. But inside, there was now a quiet awareness of all of it, not changing anything, not guiding anything, just watching. And that's where things become strange, because when life is repeated without awareness, it feels normal. But when the same life is repeated with even a small amount of awareness, it starts to feel different. Not wrong, not right, just exposed, like something that was always there is now slightly uncovered. And no one talks about it, no one explains it, because no one fully understands it. It's just there, growing slowly, quietly, without asking for attention and without offering answers. And still, everything continues exactly the same.
The Full History of the Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. A deep narrative account. In the early 20th century, the United States was a nation still deeply divided along racial lines. Though slavery had officially ended decades earlier, the systems that replaced it, Jim Crow laws, segregation, and racial violence, continued to shape the everyday lives of Black Americans. Yet even within this harsh reality, there were places where Black communities not only survived, but thrived. One such place was Greenwood, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Its story and its tragic destruction would become one of the most devastating and long-suppressed chapters in American history. The Rise of Greenwood, Black Wall Street. Greenwood was not just another neighborhood. It was a symbol of Black excellence, independence, and economic success at a time when opportunities were heavily restricted. Founded in the early 1900s, Greenwood quickly developed into a prosperous district. Black entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business owners built a self-sustaining community. Because segregation laws prevented Black residents from shopping or doing business in white-owned establishments, money circulated within Greenwood. This led to the growth of a strong local economy. There were grocery stores, banks, hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, newspapers, and even a hospital. The community became so successful that it earned the nickname Black Wall Street. People came from across the country to see what was possible there. Greenwood was not just economically strong, it was culturally vibrant. Jazz music filled the air at night. Families gathered in well-built homes, and children attended schools that emphasized pride and education. But this success also drew resentment. The racial climate of the time. To understand what happened in Tulsa, one must understand the broader environment of the United States in the early 1900s. This was a period marked by intense racial hostility. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were active and growing in influence. Lynchings and racial violence were not uncommon. World War I had recently ended, and many black soldiers returned home expecting greater respect and rights after serving their country. Instead, they faced the same discrimination, and often worse. The year 1919 became known as the Red Summer because of the widespread racial violence that erupted across American cities. Tulsa was not immune to these tensions. While Greenwood thrived, many white residents viewed its success with jealousy and suspicion. Economic competition, combined with deeply rooted racism, created a volatile situation. The incident that sparked it all. The immediate trigger for the massacre occurred on May 30, 1921. A young black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in a building in downtown Tulsa. The elevator operator was a young white woman named Sarah Page. Something happened inside that elevator. Exactly what remains unclear to this day. Some believe Rowland may have tripped and accidentally grabbed Page to steady himself. Others think she may have been startled and screamed. Regardless of what truly happened, the incident was reported as an assault. The next day, a local newspaper published a sensational headline suggesting that Rowland had attacked Page. Rumors spread quickly, and tensions escalated. Gathering storm. On May 31, 1921, a crowd of white residents gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. They demanded that he be handed over, likely for lynching. Hearing about this, a group of black men, many of them World War I veterans, went to the courthouse to offer their help in protecting Rowland. They were armed, as they feared what might happen if the mob gained control. Initially, the situation remained tense but controlled. The sheriff assured them that Rowland would be safe. The black men left, but returned later as the white crowd grew larger and more aggressive. At some point during the confrontation, a white man attempted to disarm a black veteran. A struggle followed, and a gunshot rang out. That single shot ignited chaos. The massacre began. After the gunshot, violence erupted almost instantly. White mobs began attacking black residents in downtown Tulsa. As news spread, the violence moved towards Greenwood. Throughout the night and into the next day, Greenwood was under siege. White mobs looted homes and businesses, setting them to fire. Witnesses reported seeing airplanes flying overhead, dropping incendiary devices and firing shots. Homes were burned to the ground. Families fled for their lives. People were shot in the streets. The scale of destruction was massive. Law enforcement did little to stop the violence. In many cases, they actively participated. Black residents were arrested and placed in detention centers, supposedly for their own safety, while white rioters continued their destruction unchecked. Destruction of a community. By June 1, 1921, Greenwood had been almost entirely destroyed. More than 1,000 homes were burned. Nearly 100 businesses were reduced to ashes. Schools, churches, and hospitals were destroyed. Thousands of black residents were left homeless. The death toll remains uncertain. Official reports at the time listed around 36 deaths, but historians now estimate that between 100 and 300 people were killed. Many bodies were never recovered or were buried in unmarked graves. The economic loss was devastating. Millions of dollars worth of property was destroyed, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Aftermath and silence. In the immediate aftermath, survivors faced unimaginable hardship. Thousands were held in internment camps and required to carry identification to prove they were not prisoners. When they were finally released, they returned to find their homes gone, their businesses destroyed, and their lives shattered. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, often citing riot clauses. The city government provided little assistance. There was no meaningful effort to compensate the victims or rebuild the community. Even more shocking was the silence that followed. For decades, the Tulsa Race Massacre was largely omitted from history books. Newspapers avoided discussing it. Schools did not teach it. Many survivors were too afraid to speak about what they had experienced. It was as if the event had been erased from history. Rebuilding against all odds. But despite everything, the people of Greenwood showed incredible resilience. Slowly, they began to rebuild. Homes were reconstructed, businesses reopened, and the community started to recover. However, it never fully regained its former prosperity. Urban development projects in later decades further disrupted the area, including the construction of highways that cut through the neighborhood. Still, the spirit of Greenwood endured. Rediscovery and recognition. It was not until the late 19th century that the Tulsa Race Massacre began to receive widespread attention. In the 1990s, an official investigation was launched. The Tulsa Race Riot Commission, later renamed the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission, was established to study the event and its impact. Their findings confirmed the scale of the violence and the role played by local authorities. They also recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants. In recent years, the massacre has been included in school curricula and discussed more openly in public discourse. Mass graves have been investigated, and efforts have been made to honor the victims. Why this history matters. The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre stands as one of the most tragic and overlooked events in American history. For decades, it remained buried in silence, its lessons ignored. Today, as more people learn about what happened in Greenwood, there is an opportunity to reflect, to acknowledge the past, and to ensure that such events are never forgotten. History is not just what is written in books, it is what we choose to remember. And the story of Tulsa is one that must be remembered.
The Tulsa Race Massacre, Part 2. Deep Aftermath, Hidden Truths, and Generational Impact. The days after the flames. When the fires finally died down in early June of 1921, the Greenwood district no longer resembled the thriving community it had been just days before. What once stood as a powerful symbol of Black economic independence had been reduced to ashes, smoke, and silence. Survivors walked through streets that were no longer streets, just paths of debris and charred remains. Familiar landmarks were gone. Homes that once held generations of memories were now piles of burnt wood and broken bricks. The smell of smoke lingered in the air for days, mixing with grief, fear, and disbelief. But what made the situation even more devastating was not just the destruction, it was what came next. Mass arrests of the victims. In one of the most disturbing aspects of the aftermath, Black survivors were not treated as victims. Instead, many were treated as suspects. Thousands of Black residents were rounded up by authorities and taken to detention centers. These included convention halls, fairgrounds, and open spaces surrounded by guards. Some estimates suggest that over 6,000 Black individuals were detained. They were forced to carry identification tags, almost like prisoners of war, just to move freely within their own city. Armed guards monitored them. To be released, many had to be vouched for by white employers or citizens. Meanwhile, those who had participated in the destruction faced little to no consequences. The failure of justice. In the days and weeks that followed, there were calls for investigations. There were promises of justice, but those promises quickly faded. A grand jury was assembled to examine the events. However, instead of holding the white mobs accountable, the blame was largely shifted onto the black community. The official narrative suggested that the violence had been provoked by black residents themselves. No significant prosecutions were carried out against those who had burned homes, looted businesses, or killed innocent people. Justice, in this case, was not just denied, it was reversed. The economic betrayal. For the survivors, rebuilding their lives required financial support. Many had insurance policies that should have helped them recover their losses, but insurance companies refused to pay. They used clauses that excluded coverage for damages caused by riots. Since the event was labeled a riot rather than a massacre, claims were denied across the board. This decision crushed any immediate hope of rebuilding. Families who had lost everything received nothing. The economic damage extended far beyond 1921. Generational wealth, homes, businesses, savings was wiped out overnight. The long-term financial impact on black families in Tulsa would be felt for decades. Attempts to erase Greenwood. Instead of helping rebuild Greenwood, city officials took steps that suggested a different agenda. There were proposals to rezone the area for industrial use. New building codes were introduced that made it extremely difficult for former residents to rebuild their homes. These codes required expensive materials and construction methods that many survivors simply could not afford. It seemed as though the city wanted to prevent Greenwood from ever rising again. However, the community resisted. Rebuilding through determination. Despite the lack of support and, in many cases, active resistance, Greenwood residents began to rebuild. Using whatever resources they had, people constructed temporary shelters. Slowly, businesses reopened. Churches were rebuilt. Schools resumed operations. This rebuilding effort was not funded by the government or insurance payouts. It was driven by sheer determination. By the late 1920s, Greenwood had regained some of its economic activity. While it never fully returned to its pre-1921 peak, it once again became a center of black life in Tulsa. This resilience stands as one of the most powerful aspects of the story. The long silence. Perhaps one of the most shocking elements of the Tulsa Race Massacre is not just what happened, but how it was forgotten. For decades, the event was largely absent from public memory. It was not taught in schools. It was rarely mentioned in newspapers. Many official records were lost or destroyed. Survivors often chose not to speak about it. Some feared retaliation. Others found the memories too painful. Parents did not tell their children. An entire generation grew up without knowing what had happened in their own city. This silence was not accidental. It was a form of erasure. Psychological impact on survivors. The trauma experienced by survivors did not end with the physical destruction. It continued in the form of psychological scars. Many lived with nightmares and flashbacks, fear of authority, distrust of institutions, anxiety about safety and stability. Children who witnessed the violence carried those memories into adulthood. Families passed down not just stories, but also fear. This type of trauma, often referred to today as generational trauma, affected not just individuals, but entire communities. The role of media. At the time of the massacre, newspapers played a critical role in escalating tensions. The initial report about the elevator incident was sensationalized. Headlines exaggerated the situation, fueling anger among white residents. After the massacre, coverage shifted. Some newspapers downplayed the violence.
others justified the actions of the mob. Even more troubling, certain articles and records disappeared over time. Pages were removed from archives, stories were buried. This manipulation of information contributed to the long-term silence surrounding the event. Rediscovery begins. It was not until many decades later, around the 1970s and 1980s, that researchers, historians, and community members began to revisit what had happened in Tulsa. Survivors who were still alive started to share their stories. Oral histories were recorded. Scholars began to piece together evidence from scattered sources. This process was slow and often resisted, but it marked the beginning of a shift. The truth was starting to resurface. The 1990s investigation. In 1997, the state of Oklahoma established an official commission to investigate the massacre. This marked a turning point. The commission conducted extensive research, including interviews with survivors, examination of historical documents, analysis of physical evidence. Their findings confirmed that the event was far more violent and destructive than previously acknowledged. They also concluded that local authorities had failed to protect Black residents and in some cases had contributed to the violence. Recommendations and controversy. The Commission made several recommendations, including financial compensation for survivors, scholarships for descendants, economic development programs for the Greenwood area. However, implementing these recommendations proved difficult. While some steps were taken, such as creating memorials and providing limited support, full reparations were not granted. This remains a topic of debate and discussion even today. Searching for mass graves. One of the most haunting aspects of the Tulsa Race Massacre is not just how many people truly died, but the question of how many were truly died. For years, there were rumors of mass graves, locations where victims had been buried without records or markers. In recent years, efforts have been made to locate these sites using modern technology. Ground-penetrating radar and archaeological excavations have been used to identify potential burial areas. These investigations are ongoing, and they represent an attempt to bring closure to a painful chapter. Greenwood today. Today, the Greenwood district still exists, but it is very different from what it once was. There are memorials and museums dedicated to preserving the history of the massacre. Efforts have been made to honor the victims and educate future generations. At the same time, the area continues to face economic challenges. The legacy of 1921 is still visible, not just in buildings, but in opportunities that were lost. Generational impact. The destruction of Greenwood did more than eliminate homes and businesses. It disrupted the transfer of wealth across generations. Families who might have built lasting financial stability were forced to start over with nothing. This had long-term consequences for education, housing, and economic mobility.
The Tulsa Race Massacre, Part 3. Hidden Power Structures, Cultural Memory, and the Fight for Justice. The power behind the silence. By the time the physical destruction of Greenwood had ended, another kind of force began to take control, one that was less visible but equally powerful. This force was not made of fire or weapons, but of influence, authority, and control over information. In Tulsa, like many American cities at the time, power was concentrated in the hands of a small group of individuals, business leaders, politicians, law enforcement officials, and newspaper publishers. These individuals had the ability to shape public narratives, influence investigations, and decide which stories were told and which were buried. After the massacre, this network of influence played a critical role in controlling how the event would be remembered. Instead of calling it a massacre, many official accounts referred to it as a riot. This single word shifted the meaning. A riot suggests chaos from both sides, while a massacre acknowledges one-sided violence. By choosing the word riot, those in power avoided responsibility. Language became a tool of erasure. The role of local government. City officials in Tulsa were not passive observers during or after the massacre. Evidence suggests that their actions, both direct and indirect, helped shape the outcome. Police officers not only failed to stop the violence, but in some cases actively participated in it. Members of law enforcement were reported to have deputized white citizens, effectively giving them authority to carry weapons and act in the name of the law. After the violence ended, city leaders focused less on justice and more on restoring order, an order that did not include accountability. Their priorities were clear: prevent further unrest, protect the city's reputation, avoid financial liability. Justice for the victims was not at the top of the list. Courts and legal barriers. For survivors seeking justice, the legal system offered little hope. Lawsuits were filed against the city and insurance companies. Survivors attempted to claim compensation for lost property, destroyed businesses, and personal injuries. But these efforts faced multiple obstacles. Courts dismissed cases on technical grounds. Insurance claims were denied under riot clauses. Legal fees were too high for many survivors. In effect, the legal system became another barrier rather than a path to justice. Over time, many survivors gave up their claims, not because they lacked evidence, but because the system was designed in a way that made success nearly impossible. Disappearance of evidence. One of the most troubling aspects of the Tulsa Race Massacre is the disappearance of key records. Newspaper articles from the time, especially those that may have incited violence, were removed from archives. Official documents went missing. Photographs and reports were lost or destroyed. This was not a simple accident. Historians believe that there were deliberate efforts to remove or hide evidence that could expose the full truth of what happened. Without records, it became easier to deny the scale of the violence. Without documentation, it became harder for future generations to understand the event. History was not just forgotten, it was altered. Oral histories, voices that survived. Even though written records were lost, the truth did not disappear completely. It lived on in the memories of survivors. For decades, these stories were passed down quietly within families. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the night the sky turned red with flames. Parents shared stories of fleeing their homes, of hiding, of loss. These oral histories became crucial sources of information. When researchers began to revisit the massacre in the late 20th century, they relied heavily on these personal accounts. Survivors described details that had never been recorded in official reports, details about violence, destruction, and survival. Their voices filled the gaps left by missing documents. Cultural impact and representation. As awareness of the Tulsa Race Massacre grew, it began to appear in literature, film, and art. Writers used storytelling to bring the event to life. Filmmakers created documentaries and fictional works inspired by the massacre. Artists used paintings and installations to express the emotional weight of the tragedy. These cultural representations played an important role in spreading awareness. They reached audiences who might never read a history book. They made the story more accessible, more human, and more immediate. At the same time, they raised important questions. How should such a painful event be represented? Who has the right to tell the story? How can accuracy be balanced with artistic expression? These questions continue to shape how the massacre is remembered today. Education and the struggle for inclusion. For much of the 20th century, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not included in school curricula. Students in Oklahoma and across the United States grew up without learning about it. Teachers were not given materials or guidance. Textbooks ignored the event entirely. This began to change in recent decades. Educators, activists, and historians pushed for the inclusion of the massacre in school programs. They argued that understanding this history was essential for understanding the present. Today, the event is taught in many schools, though the depth and detail vary. The inclusion of the massacre in education represents a shift from silence to acknowledgement. The role of descendants. The descendants of survivors have played a key role in keeping the memory of the massacre alive. Many have become activists, researchers, and storytellers. They have worked to preserve family histories, collect documents, and advocate for recognition and justice. For them, the massacre is not just history, it is personal. They speak not only of what was lost in 1921, but of how that loss continues to affect their lives today. Their efforts have helped bring national and international attention to the event. The fight for reparations. One of the most ongoing and controversial issues related to the Tulsa Race Massacre is the question of reparations. Survivors and their descendants have argued that compensation is necessary to address the economic and emotional damage caused by the massacre. Supporters of reparations point to several factors: the destruction of wealth and property, the failure of the government to protect citizens, the denial of insurance claims, and the long-term economic impact on families. Opponents raise concerns about legal responsibility, funding, and precedent. Despite debates, the issue remains unresolved. Some progress has been made, such as scholarships, community investments, and memorial projects, but many argue that these measures do not go far enough. National recognition. In recent years, the Tulsa Race Massacre has gained greater recognition at the national level. Political leaders have acknowledged the event. Public ceremonies have been held to honor the victims. Anniversaries, especially the 100th anniversary in 2021, brought widespread attention. This recognition represents an important step. However, acknowledgement alone does not resolve the deeper issues. It raises awareness, but it also brings new questions about responsibility, justice, and the role of history in shaping the present. Media in the modern era. Unlike in 1921, today's media landscape allows for broader and faster dissemination of information. Social media, online platforms, and digital archives have made it easier to access historical records and share stories. Documentaries, podcasts, and online articles have introduced the Tulsa Race Massacre to global audiences. This digital age has helped ensure that the event is no longer hidden. At the same time, it has also created challenges, such as misinformation, oversimplification, and the spread of unverified claims. The responsibility to present accurate and respectful narratives remains as important as ever. The global perspective. While the Tulsa Race Massacre is a distinctly American event, its themes are universal. Issues of racial violence, economic inequality, and historical erasure are not limited to one country. As the story of Tulsa has spread, it has been studied and discussed in international contexts. Scholars have compared it to similar events around the world. This global perspective highlights the broader significance of the massacre. It is not just a local or national story, it is part of a larger human history. Memory and memorials. Today, efforts to preserve the memory of the massacre can be seen in physical spaces. Museums, monuments, and historical markers have been established in Tulsa. These sites provide education, reflection, and remembrance.
The Tulsa Race Massacre, Part 4. Hidden Economics, Lost Wealth, and the Long Shadow on Modern America. The wealth that vanished overnight. When Greenwood burned in 1921, the destruction was not limited to buildings. It erased wealth in a way that few events in American history ever have. Before the massacre, Greenwood was one of the most economically successful black communities in the United States. Money circulated within the community at an extraordinary rate. Black-owned banks issued loans, doctors treated patients, entrepreneurs ran thriving businesses, and families owned property that was steadily increasing in value. All of that disappeared in less than 24 hours. To understand the scale of loss, imagine generations of effort, savings, investments, land ownership, businesses wiped out instantly. Not damaged, not temporarily disrupted, completely erased. The estimated property loss at the time was around $1.5 to $2 million in 1921 dollars. Adjusted for today, that equals hundreds of millions of dollars. But even that number does not capture the full impact. The concept of generational wealth. Wealth is not just about what a person owns, it is about what they can pass down. Before the massacre, families in Greenwood were building generational wealth. Homes that could be inherited, businesses that could be expanded, savings that could fund education, land that could increase in value over time. All of that disappeared in less than 24 hours. Children who might have grown up in financially stable households instead grew up in poverty. Opportunities that should have existed, college education, business ownership, property investment, were suddenly out of reach. This is what makes the Tulsa Race Massacre different from many other historical events. It did not just affect one generation, it altered the economic trajectory of entire family lines. A lost economic model. Greenwood was more than a wealthy neighborhood, it was a model of economic independence. Because of segregation, black residents had no choice but to rely on each other. This created a system where black businesses served black customers, profits stayed within the community, economic growth was self-sustaining. This model proved that even under oppressive conditions, a community could thrive through cooperation and internal support. When Greenwood was destroyed, this model was also destroyed. It was not just a loss for Tulsa, it was a loss of a powerful example of economic possibility. Barriers to rebuilding wealth. Even after the physical rebuilding of Greenwood began, restoring its economic strength proved nearly impossible. Several barriers stood in the way. One, lack of capital. Without insurance payouts or government assistance, residents had no financial base to restart businesses. Two, increased regulation. New building codes made construction more expensive, limiting who could rebuild. Three, ongoing discrimination. Banks were less likely to issue loans to black residents, making investment difficult. 4. Psychological impact. After experiencing such destruction, many were hesitant to invest heavily again, fearing it could all be taken away once more. These barriers ensured that even though Greenwood physically returned, its economic power never fully recovered. The highway that divided a community. Decades after the massacre, Greenwood faced another major disruption. In the mid-20th century, the U.S. government launched a nationwide highway construction program. While presented as a symbol of progress, these projects often had devastating effects on minority communities. In Tulsa, a highway was built directly through the Greenwood district. This construction destroyed homes and businesses, displaced residents, and divided the community into separate sections. The result was a second wave of damage, this time not by fire, but by infrastructure. Many historians view this as part of a broader pattern in which black communities were disproportionately affected by urban development policies. Economic inequality today. The economic consequences of the Tulsa Race Massacre are still visible today.
Studies of wealth distribution in the United States show significant gaps between black and white households. While many factors contribute to this disparity, events like the destruction of Greenwood play a major role. When wealth is lost and not restored, the effects compound over time. For example, a family that loses a business loses future income. A child who cannot afford education has fewer opportunities. A lack of property ownership limits financial stability. These effects build across generations. The Tulsa Race Massacre is one example of how historical events contribute to modern inequality. The idea of economic justice. In recent years, discussions about the massacre have shifted toward the concept of economic justice. This goes beyond acknowledging what happened. It involves addressing the long-term financial impact. Economic justice includes ideas such as direct compensation to survivors and descendants, investment in affected communities, support for education and business development. Supporters argue that without addressing the economic damage, true justice cannot be achieved. Critics question how such measures should be implemented and who should be responsible. The debate continues. Corporate and institutional responsibility. Another important question is the role of institutions. During and after the massacre, various organizations played a part. Insurance companies denied claims. Banks limited access to loans. Government agencies failed to provide support. In modern discussions, some argue that these institutions should be held accountable. There have been calls for public apologies, financial contributions to rebuilding efforts, partnerships with community organizations. While some institutions have taken steps in this direction, many believe more needs to be done. The role of education in economic recovery. Education has become a key focus in efforts to address the legacy of the massacre. Scholarships and educational programs have been created for descendants of Greenwood residents. These initiatives aim to provide opportunities that were lost due to the destruction of wealth. Education is seen as a way to break cycles of poverty and create new pathways for success. However, education alone cannot fully replace the wealth that was lost. It is one piece of a much larger solution. Modern revitalization efforts. In recent years, there have been efforts to revitalize the Greenwood district. These include supporting Black-owned businesses, promoting tourism and historical awareness, developing cultural and economic programs. Some projects aim to recreate the spirit of Black Wall Street, encouraging entrepreneurship and community investment. While these efforts are important, they also raise questions. Can a community truly be restored after such loss? Who benefits from redevelopment? How can history be preserved while moving forward? The answers are complex and ongoing. The symbolism of Greenwood. Today, Greenwood represents more than just a place. It is a symbol. It stands for what was achieved, what was destroyed, what can be rebuilt. For many, it is a reminder of both injustice and resilience. For others, it is a call to action, a reason to address inequalities and support community growth. The national conversation. The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre has become part of a larger national conversation about history, race, and justice. It is often discussed alongside other events that were ignored or suppressed. This conversation includes how history is taught, whose stories are included, what responsibilities exist today. The inclusion of Tulsa in this discussion reflects a broader shift toward confronting difficult aspects of history. Looking forward. The future of Greenwood and the legacy of the massacre depends on ongoing efforts. These include continued research and documentation, open and honest education, community investment, policy changes. While the past cannot be changed, the way it is understood and addressed
can shape the future. Conclusion of Part 4. Part 4 reveals the deeper economic impact of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It shows that the destruction of Greenwood was not just physical, it was financial, generational, and systemic. The loss of wealth created ripple effects that continue to this day. Understanding these effects is essential for understanding the full meaning of the massacre.
The Tulsa Race Massacre, Part 5. Modern Justice, Political Struggles, Global Parallels, and the Unfinished Story. A century later, why Tulsa still matters. By the time the world reached the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 2021, the event had transformed from a hidden tragedy into a widely discussed chapter of history. What had once been buried in silence was now part of national and even global conversations. But recognition did not mean resolution. Instead, it opened deeper questions. What does justice look like after 100 years? Can historical wrongs ever truly be repaired? Who is responsible for fixing the past? Tulsa became more than history. It became a test of how modern society deals with historical injustice. The last living survivors. One of the most powerful elements of the modern Tulsa story is the voices of the last living survivors. As time passed, the number of people who had directly experienced the massacre became smaller. By the 21st century, only a few remained. These individuals carried memories from 1921 into the present day. As children, they had seen homes burning, families running, violence in the streets. As adults, they became witnesses, not just to history, but to the long silence that followed. When they began sharing their stories publicly, their testimonies had a profound impact. Hearing directly from survivors made the event feel immediate and real in a way that textbooks could not. Their voices became central to the push for justice. The fight in modern courts. In recent years, new legal efforts have been made to seek justice for the victims and their descendants. Unlike earlier attempts, these cases have taken a different approach. Instead of focusing only on property damage, they address broader issues such as unjust enrichment, the idea that others benefited from the destruction, ongoing harm caused by the massacre, and responsibility of local authorities. These legal battles are complex. Supporters argue that justice delayed should not mean justice denied. Opponents argue that too much time has passed and that legal responsibility is unclear. The courts have become a space where history, law, and morality intersect. Political reactions and divisions. The Tulsa Race Massacre has also become a political issue. Different groups and leaders have different views on how it should be addressed. Some advocate for full reparations, government accountability, policy changes to address inequality. Others emphasize historical recognition without financial compensation, moving forward rather than revisiting the past, broader economic programs instead of targeted reparations. These differences reflect larger debates within society about history, responsibility, and fairness. Tulsa is not just about the past, it is part of ongoing political conversations. The role of public memory. Memory is powerful. For decades, the absence of memory allowed the Tulsa Race Massacre to fade from public awareness. Now, the presence of memory is shaping how people understand history. Public memory takes many forms: museums and memorials, documentaries and books, school lessons, public discussions. Each of these contributes to a shared understanding. But memory is not neutral. It is influenced by choices, what to include, what to emphasize, and how to present it. The way Tulsa is remembered today will shape how it is understood in the future. Media, technology, and the digital age. In the modern era, technology has transformed how history is shared. The story of Tulsa is now accessible worldwide through online archives, social media, digital documentaries, and virtual tours of Greenwood. This accessibility has several effects. Greater awareness. People from different countries and backgrounds can learn about Tulsa. Diverse perspectives. More voices can contribute to the conversation. Faster spread of information. Stories can reach millions within minutes. However, technology also brings challenges. Misinformation can spread quickly. Complex history can be oversimplified. Emotional narratives can overshadow factual accuracy. The digital age makes it easier to remember, but also requires careful responsibility. Global parallels. Tulsa in a wider context. Although the Tulsa Race Massacre is rooted in American history, its themes are universal. Around the world, there have been similar events where communities were destroyed, wealth was taken, histories were hidden. Comparisons have been made with ethnic violence in various countries, colonial-era destruction of communities, and forced displacement of populations. These parallels show that Tulsa is not an isolated case. It is part of a larger human story. Understanding Tulsa can help people understand similar events globally. Lessons from Tulsa. The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre offers several important lessons. 1. Success does not guarantee safety. Greenwood was thriving, yet it was still vulnerable. 2. Systems matter. Institutions, law enforcement, media, government play a crucial role in shaping outcomes. 3. Silence has consequences. Ignoring history allows injustice to continue. 4. Resilience is powerful. Despite everything, the people of Greenwood rebuilt their lives. These lessons go beyond Tulsa. They apply to societies everywhere. The debate over reparations. Reparations remain one of the most debated aspects of the Tulsa story. Arguments in favor include compensation for lost wealth, acknowledgement of government failure, addressing long-term economic impact. Arguments against include difficulty in determining responsibility, challenges in calculating compensation, concerns about setting legal precedents. Some proposed solutions include direct payments to descendants, community investment funds, educational and business grants. The debate continues with no clear resolution. The emotional weight of history. Beyond economics and politics, the Tulsa Race Massacre carries deep emotional significance. For many, it represents pain and loss, injustice and zulm, strength and survival. This emotional dimension is important. History is not just facts, it is human experience. Understanding Tulsa requires not only knowledge, but empathy. The future of Greenwood. Today, Greenwood stands at a crossroads. Efforts are being made to preserve historical sites, support local businesses, promote cultural awareness. At the same time, challenges remain: economic inequality, urban development pressures, balancing history with progress. The future of Greenwood will depend on how these challenges are addressed. A story still being written. The Tulsa Race Massacre is not a closed chapter. New discoveries continue to emerge. New voices continue to speak. New generations continue to learn. History is not static. It evolves. What Tulsa means today may be different from what it means tomorrow. Final reflection. From its rise as Black Wall Street to its destruction, from decades of silence to modern recognition, the story of Tulsa is complex and powerful. It is a story of achievement and loss, silence and rediscovery, injustice and resilience. Most importantly, it is a reminder that history can be hidden but not erased, a reminder that truth may be delayed but it will surface, a reminder that what we choose to remember shapes the future.
final conclusion of the series. With this final part, the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre becomes complete, not in the sense that everything is resolved, but in the sense that its many layers have been explored. From the events of 1921 to the ongoing search for justice, this is a history that continues to matter. And it will continue to matter for generations to come.
Imagine you're standing in a flat, dusty field in Mesopotamia about 6,000 years ago. There's no wind, there's just the sound of a small wooden shovel hitting wet river mud. Thwack, slap, thwack. Before we had the uniform red bricks you see in every wall today, people just grabbed mud. They didn't have a plan. They would scoop up a glob of clay, pat it into a rough oval, sort of like a heavy, wet loaf of bread, and just leave it there. They called these hand-formed bricks. Every single one was a different size. If you were building a wall, nothing fit. You'd put one lump down, then another lump that was slightly taller, and you'd spend the next 4 hours just shoving smaller pebbles into the gaps. It was slow, it was tedious, it was the beginning of a very long, very boring story. Eventually, someone, and we don't know who because their name was lost in the dust of time, got tired of the lumps. They made a frame, just 4 pieces of wood nailed together into a rectangle. This was the first mold. Now, imagine being the person assigned to fill that mold. You take the mud, you press it into the corners, you scrape the top flat with a straight piece of wood, then you lift the mold, you move 6 inches to the right, you do it again. You do this 10,000 times. The sun is hot, the mud is drying on your skin, and the only thing changing is the length of your shadow. The sun-dried era lasted for thousands of years. Think about that. For 3,000 years, the technology of the brick didn't change. People just waited for the sun to do the work. If it was cloudy, the construction stopped. Everyone just sat around looking at wet mud, waiting for the moisture to evaporate. The chemical process of evaporation is actually quite slow. The water molecules at the surface have to gain enough kinetic energy to break free into the air. Inside the brick, the water has to migrate through tiny microscopic pores in the clay to reach the surface. It's a literal watching paint dry situation, but with dirt. Then came the kiln. This sounds exciting, but it wasn't. It just meant that instead of waiting for the sun, people built a giant oven and waited for a fire instead. The bricks had to be stacked in a very specific, very repetitive pattern called weaving to let the heat move through. If you stacked them too close, the middle wouldn't bake. If you stacked them too far apart, you wasted space. So men spent their entire lives from sunrise to sunset stacking rectangles in a dark, smoky room. Clink, slide, thud. Clink, slide, thud. By the time the Roman Empire showed up, they decided they needed rules. The Romans loved rules. They didn't want sort of rectangular bricks. They wanted the Lydian standard. They had a specific size, 1.5 Roman feet long and 1 Roman foot wide. If a bricklayer brought a brick that was half an inch off, the supervisor would just stare at him until he left. Imagine a Roman brick factory. It's just rows and rows of identical red slabs, thousands of them. If you've seen one, you've seen them all. And yet, they kept making them. For 500 years, the Roman brick stayed exactly the same. It was so stable, so predictable, that it becomes a sort of white noise in history. No one writes poems about the bricks. They just walked past them day after day, year after year, until the red clay blurred into a single, unending hum of architectural boredom.